Oh no! No!
The third senior? No. Is that you? Oh, I think that should be you.
I know. Where are you gonna
That's what I was thinking.
Good to see you. Yes. We met the panel.
Because we're starting at 7 or 7:30.
Steve, are you ready for us?
Thank you.
All right, welcome everybody to our panel discussion on beyond property taxes, understanding public education funding in Vermont. I'm Steve Rosenberg. I'm a Moortown rep on the school board. I'll be moderating this tonight. Yeah, thanks. Let me just tell you how the evening's going to work. We're going to start off with a short presentation by Lisa Essler, Director of Finance and Operations for the district, about some of the nuts and bolts of the complicated system of funding education. After that, we'll have a panel discussion with our panelists who I'll introduce until around 8 or so. Then we'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. So with that, Lisa, would you like to do your presentation?
Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening, and thank you for all the panelists. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I have a lot of slides I'm going to go through rather quickly. My presentation will be posted on our website, and I please encourage anyone that has wants additional information or questions, please do not hesitate to pick up a phone and call me. I'd be happy to meet with anybody to be able to explain the educational formula system in the state of Vermont. Unfortunately, Jasper is going to meet my advancer down there, so you can move to the next slide. So the educational finance system in Vermont is unique, complex. It is set out to ensure fairness and equality throughout the state of Vermont. It aims to have local decision-making with statewide equity. However, it comes with both benefits and challenges. The educational fund is the amount of money that is needed to fund each and every school budget in Vermont, so all of the educational spend. It is separate from the general fund, although the general fund has supplemented the educational fund in the past, one-time funding. And it represents a fourth of all state spending. Just keep in mind, the voter-approved budget is what's called the educational spend. Next slide. How we achieve and what the educational spend is taking the voter-approved budget or the expenses of the district minus any offsetting revenues, and that equals the educational spend. Next slide. So the educational finance system is what we're going to be talking about tonight, and there's three components we can consider. There's the spending for all the school districts. There's the revenue that's generated to fund those educational spends throughout the school districts in Vermont. And there's other uses of the ed fund. Next slide. The educational finance system really is made up of, again, educational spending, and there's cost drivers behind the educational spending: health insurance, benefits, salaries, special ed, and I'll talk about that a little more. There's also revenue, and that mostly comes from tax revenue. Primarily 2/3 of that comes from homestead tax rates, whether it be the homestead or non-homestead rate. And then again, the other uses of the educational fund that has been funded with educational dollars. Next slide. The educational fund basically spends of the educational payment. 80% of the educational fund is spent on educational payment or educational spending to fund all the school districts throughout Vermont. The remaining portion is for category aid and for one-time funding. Next slide. So that 20%, remaining 20% in the educational fund, again, is, and I gave you numbers that were represented, and all the sources are down on the below. You can click those links and see where I found those sources. And this is just telling you what the other sources of revenue that fund the educational fund. So some of this is the category grants and category funding actually goes back to the school districts to pay for certain things, transportation aid, state placed students, special education aid. Again, please check out that source and to find out more detail. Next slide. It is estimated the educational fund or the education costs in the state of Vermont this year is close to $2.3 billion. Next slide. Well, what makes up that revenue? Again, I said 2/3 of that revenue comes in from homestead tax, whether homestead or non-homestead taxes. And the rest comes from sales tax, which is all state sales tax, purchase and uses, meals and room tax, lottery proceeds, and other minor sources, Medicaid, solar, and use in land. Next slide. Here is a representation of the ed fund revenue sources. You'll see, again, 2/3 property, homestead makes up 24.7% in fiscal year 24. And then on the bottom portion of the pie chart, you'll see non-homestead makes up 38.5%. So again, 2/3 of the revenue going into the educational fund is from homestead taxes and non-homestead taxes. Next slide. I've just wanted to share with you the amount, from fiscal year 16 through fiscal year 25, the revenue amounts by sources. So this is a good display showing you, again, non-homestead and homestead are the blue colors, and then all of the other revenue that's funding the ed fund. Next slide. So again, it's estimated this year is $2.3 billion to fund educational spending expenses. So the state monitors what revenue's coming in from the non-property tax funds, and they're then looking at to see how much they have to make up with the property tax funds with the homestead and non-homestead. Next slide. So as I said, there are three components to the educational funding finance system: spending, revenue, and other spending that comes out of the ed fund. So again, the cost drivers for the educational spending are personnel, staffing, benefits, health insurance, special education, facilities. We have a lot of deferred maintenance throughout our districts, and I see Jill is shaking her head over there. Tuition, and then also our delivery models. Depending on, there's a lot of talk about small schools throughout the state of Vermont, of schools that have 50 or less students, class sizes, and the number of class sizes in all the districts. And a lot of our towns or rural towns in Vermont. So, again, the district size and the infrastructure all plays a part of that educational spend and how the districts are spending those dollars for their educational spend. Next slide. So I mentioned educational spend. One of the cost drivers are personnel, teachers, administration, and support staff. Vermont's declining student enrollments are declining. However, our teachers, our salaries, our positions, or FTEs are increasing. So yes, they're declining, but it's often very difficult to reduce those teachers because it's not in one designated area. I mean, it could be one teacher here, one teacher here, one teacher here, and I'm talking at a district level. But overall in Vermont, the enrollments are declining. Our district has stayed steady over the last couple of years, but the projection had been declining, but we actually have been basically staying steady. Next slide. I'm trying to go through quickly, Steve. Another cost in education spending is the cost of special education. The cost of special education in Vermont is increasing. They're projecting at least at 10%. However, the census block grant that funds special education is not increasing as much. Our district special education increase for next year is beyond 10%. So our district is increasing even more. Our special ed or census block grant only went up by 3%. But if you're combining our salaries and our below the line operational costs for special education, we're seeing almost a 19% increase in our special education costs for Harwood. And in comparison for the Vermont, you'll see special education estimates versus actuals. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the estimates for special education spending and the actual. This is based up through fiscal year 23. You'll see the actuals are increasing where they estimated special education expenses dropping, in particular after COVID, but COVID also impacted us with MTSS, social and emotional learning. You'll see also extraordinary costs. An extraordinary cost is anything over educational spending at a threshold. The current threshold for fiscal year 26 is projected to be 67,638. You'll see the previous year's numbers. So any cost for a student that exceeds 67,638, we receive 95% of that extraordinary cost back into the district. But again, those costs are rising as well and not matching the census block grant that we are receiving for the district. As I mentioned, another large expense in the education spending is our facilities. Our facilities' immediate need as of January 2024, it was reported to be $228 million over the state of Vermont. And over the next 2 decades, it's expected to be $6.3 billion. So there's a lot of deferred maintenance out there throughout the entire Vermont school districts in Vermont. Again, also overall tuition costs have increased. Next slide. Revenue generation. We all share the burden statewide in terms of paying for educational costs. And this came about in Act 60. I'm sure you've all heard of Act 60 that happened in 1997, where it's basically called the educational equal opportunity, where we all are sharing and all have equality education for all of our students throughout all of Vermont. So we share that burden in educating our students. Part of it is where we have some towns would raise more money with taxes and other towns wouldn't raise as much money. And we wanted to make sure that all Vermont students had equal opportunity to education. So that's part of Act 60. One of the things with revenue generation, there is an increasing disconnect between local budgets and the tax paid by communities. And local decreases in spending doesn't translate to decreased taxes. If you recall fiscal year 25, but in our shared system overall, if statewide spending, all district spendings do, reduce or decline the educational spend, then there's no additional burden and taxes could be lowered. Next slide. So I just wanted to share with you, based on town tax from our 6 towns, and looking at what we collect that goes into the educational fund for educational homestead, you'll see in fiscal year 23, I don't have 24 rates yet, but here's 23. You'll see by our towns what each town collected for educational homestead tax and education non-homestead tax. In 23, all 6 towns totaled $50.7 million. However, our voter-approved budget was $42.6 million in fiscal year 23. So again, we're sharing the burden. So we maintained in the district $42.6 million to support our educational spend. So almost 84 cents on every dollar stayed in the district. 16 cents went to other districts to help other districts that have been underfunded. So again, we're sharing that burden. Again, educational fund is capital facilities, universal meals, universal PK. These are other things that have been coming out of the ed fund. And also what I mentioned before, the cost shifts for mental health services. That is also coming out of health services, educational fund. Next slide. I just wanted to be able to share this governance, resource, and accountability. The state actually, in the end of the day, is the responsible and the authority for education in Vermont. Yet Vermont's long-standing value for local government and local decision-making is at the local level. But there is discussion about possibly, putting some parameters around that in the future. Next slide. So I just wanted to share how complicated the equalized tax system is. So where I have checks marks is basically what the district has control over within our realm. So we have control over our proposed expenditures, our estimated revenues, and to some degree our equalized pupil, which is now also called our long-term weighted average. And that came recently, and it started in fiscal year 25, because I'm already working on 26 budget, but for 25, that Act 127 changed categories and weights of students. So we actually weight different categories of students: English language learners, varsity students, high school students. They're all weighted differently. And at the back of the slide deck, you'll see all the different weights of all the different students. So it's particularly important when we're doing our data collection that we know exactly the number of students, because we want to make sure we get every dollar for every one of those students. As an example, English language learners are weighted at 2.49%, and that's a large weight. So we want to make sure we're counting every one of those students, so then we get those dollars. So again, all of this goes into getting the actual tax rate increase by town. And I know everybody's always asking me, what's going to happen to my town? What's going to happen to my tax rate? So what we need to do is, how this works is, I get the equalized pupils, we pull our expenditures, we net our revenues out of our expenses. The yield comes out in the December 1st tax letter, and that is set by the legislature, which then goes into how we get our equalized tax rate. And then that's our district equalized tax rate, and then we apply that to the CLA. Again, if you come to our next couple of budget meetings for the board, I'll be going into a lot more detail in that, and I can explain that in more depth. Here's a 5-year budget history of Harwood's district's educational spend, you'll see in fiscal year 25, we had a 5.4% increase. Next slide. Here's where you'll see the numbers. Our educational spend is $40.3 million. You take our total expenses, minus our net of 7.5 million. Our equalized pupil number is in green. You can see in Act 20, you'll see in fiscal year 24, because Act 127 didn't go into effect until fiscal year 25, we actually compared side by side the old methodology to the new methodology and what the difference is. So we didn't have a jump in students. It was just based on the weight of those students. So that's why our equalized pupil went from 1,720 to 2,647. So that's the weight of the new Act 127. You take your Act 127 weight and then you divide that by your cost per your equalized pupil, by your educational spending, and you'll get your cost per equalized pupil. The yield is set by the state. Again, it comes out in December. And this past last year in the current year, fiscal year 25, the yield was set at 9,893. And this year we had a 9 cents taxing capacity. I'm sure you've all heard me speak about the 9 cents taxing capacity. We have that for the next 5 years, and that's being reduced by 20% each year. This is just showing you a 5-year history of our taxing capacity, our equalized tax rate. I didn't get to update this slide, but this slide actually is showing you we had a slight decrease, but in fact, we had a slight increase, but less than 1%. So our equalized tax rate, because this was based on a $10,000 yield, the yield actually came in a little lower, was 9,883. Next slide. So the big question is how does a 5.4% increase to the district spending equate to tax increases in each of our towns? So if you look at Warren is 21.2%. Again, the equalized tax rate is pre-CLA, and then once you apply your district equalized tax rate to the town CLA, which is the town's common level of appraisal, then you get the tax rates. And there's a difference there. And that's how you get from a 5.4% educational spend increase to these tax rates, the town tax rates. So key takeaways, very important. Vermont has a unique educational financial system. I won't read these key takeaways because I know we're short on time, but they're here. Please look at them. They're important. Next slide. Again, this is where I started. Educational formula system in Vermont is unique. It's complex. It's fairness and equity. And it aims to have balance. And again, there's benefits and challenges to this system. Next slide. I come from New Jersey. I was associate dean at a research university, Rutgers University, for 28 years. New Jersey has one of the highest state property taxes. And I've learned a lot since I've moved to Vermont permanently. So it is complex. Next slide. And the next several slides are lots of information that are available, links, educational finance timelines. But one important message I do want to share, if you just bring that up, there is a great cartoon video that Vermont Public, don't play it, just I wanted to show you what it is. I do suggest you go to that, look at that. It's very informing. Did I do good?
Thanks very much, Lisa. I appreciate it. All right, we have a very complex system. We have a terrific panel that is not going to solve all our problems, I've been told, but we can have very good discussion, I think. So let me introduce the panel members. And the first thing I'd like to say is the panel members belong to lots of committees and lots of organizations, but the opinions or views they give tonight are their own and don't represent these organizations. Okay, so Senator Martine Larocque Gulick is a state senator from Burlington. She represents Chittenden Central District, including Burlington, Essex Junction, Essex Town, Winooski, and a small portion of Colchester. She's on the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. She's vice chair of the Senate Education Committee. She's also a four-term school commissioner in Burlington and is the Western Chittenden representative to the Vermont School Boards Association, as well as a former high school teacher in Vermont and overseas. And she believes public education is fundamental to a successful and robust democracy, as do I. Tammy Colby. Tammy's a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, or AIR, and an associate research professor at the University of Vermont. Dr. Colby has more than 25 years experience working with states and the federal government to develop and implement pre-K through 16 education funding formulas. Currently, she co-leads AIR's school finance research team that works with states nationwide on K-12 school finance. She's one of the experts leading the federal government's new Center on Fiscal Equity, which provides technical assistance to states and districts on strategic finance to promote fair and efficient uses of educational resources. And she directs the federal government's national study of special education spending. She serves as one of the editors for Education, Finance, and Policy, the flagship journal in education, economics, and finance, and sits on the editorial board for the Journal of Education Finance. Tammy lived in the Valley for many years and currently lives in Plainfield. Dr. Mike Licklider, our superintendent. Mike's passionate about the ability of public education to provide all students with a high quality education and is proud to be the superintendent of our district. Mike's goal is to improve classroom experiences for students and teachers and be a champion in the community for public education. Mike started his career in 1991 as a middle school and high school social studies teacher in the city of York, Pennsylvania. Following experiences as a high school assistant principal, middle school principal, and assistant superintendent for personnel, he was named superintendent of schools for the Penn Manor School District in 2009. Penn Manor serves 5,400 students in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. After finishing his educational career in Pennsylvania, Mike was drawn to the Harvard Unified Union School District through his travels in the state, particularly during the time his daughter attended University of Vermont. He's enjoying the opportunity to learn, discover, and help Harvard make the progress the school desires for its students and community. And finally, Senator Andrew Perchlik. Senator Perchlik is one of the state senators representing the towns in our district. He's chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, vice chair of the Appropriations Committee, and served 4 years on the Education Committee. His father was a high school teacher who was also a college professor teaching political science and also taught education majors how to teach social studies. Senator Perchlik lives with his wife and 3 children in Marshfield. So it's a pretty great panel. I'll start off with a kind of big question.
Can you speak up?
I will try.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we went through a very difficult budget period last year and may be in for another one. I'd like to ask the panelists what changes we can expect the legislature to consider for the education funding formula. And I'd like to ask the non-senators on the panel, what changes would they like to see? Any?
Senators to go first, I assume.
Yeah.
Well, they're after us. So, I think it's going to be difficult. We have a commission. You know, at the end of last session, we had the yield bill that I don't think anybody was really happy with, but we wanted to pass a yield bill so we could fund our public schools. But part of that was to create this commission to look at the future of our education funding. So that commission, neither of us, you're not on that, are you? No. So neither of us are on there, but they're working. Senator Cummings, you're one of your other senators. Oh, Mike's, oh, maybe Mike can tell us. But they're going to come back with some recommendations, both long-term and what we can do next year. I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, I think Lisa did an excellent job of giving you the idea of how complex it is and all the different moving parts and all the different gears. We can try to do some work on parts of that, but to really have the kind of impact that we want to see, so we don't have property tax increases like we had and like you had here in the Valley and other places. That's going to, I think, take a little longer time. I think there are things like moving some of the spending that we have in the education fund that the local board has no control over to the general fund makes sense to me. I don't know how much of a difference that's going to make as far as when you get down to your property taxes based on the complexity. I do think it should be less complex. I do want to see a tighter connection between the local votes on budgets and their local taxes. How we do that in 1 year, I to be honest with you, don't have a good answer for that. But I think one thing that's going to be different than last year is that we are going to be working with the governor and the Scott administration from day one on addressing this problem. I think, and in the past, for different reasons on both sides, if you want to think of it as two sides, that we didn't work from the very beginning on the problem. We looked at it from different angles, but we got to the end of last session and had a very difficult time with the governor saying, well, why don't you do these 10 things? And it was the last few days and we didn't feel like we had time to really vet all those. And some of them we had rejected in the past. But I think starting for the first week of the session, we're going to be bringing in the Scott administration's folks and saying, like, okay, what can we do? Because as our pro tem said the other day, we're not going to leave the legislative session with an education funding bill that the governor doesn't support. So we need to work from the governor from day one on coming up with those solutions.
Oh, good evening. Ooh, good evening, everyone. I drove from the way out in the north end of Burlington, so it's a long way, but I am happy to be here. I love talking about education, and this is certainly the time to be doing it. I spent the summer campaigning, and I can tell you that pretty much every door I knocked on, folks wanted to talk about property taxes and about schools. So it's very apropos for me to be here tonight talking about this. I think you heard my bio. I've been involved in education from many different angles. Right now, I'm sitting on a summer working group that's called the State Aid for School Construction Working Group. I put forward a construction bill when I first started 2 years ago. I'm a pretty new senator, so that was just something that I felt was really important because I come from Burlington and our kids have been in a Macy's department store, our high school kids, for many years now. Our school was found to have PCBs among other contaminants and was closed down. So we're currently building a new high school, but I felt it was important to address school construction and the moratorium that's been on state aid for school construction since 2007, because it really is becoming, a crisis level. And I can tell you I've experienced it and I've lived through the challenges of building a new high school and asking taxpayers to fund it. We went out and we had to pass a $165 million bond. That was a challenge. So this committee is really exciting because we're really thinking about what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? How are we going to fund this? We're talking a lot about capacity and scale. As you know, we have many schools that are not full because of our declining enrollment and other factors. And we have, teachers and staff that aren't necessarily working to capacity. And then, of course, we have a scale issue. We have a small state. We have a rural geography. It's tricky. It's not easy. But hopefully going forward, we can envision a system that's much more efficient, that's more affordable and that works and provides great opportunities for all students. But it's gonna be a change, and it's gonna be challenging. But I am hopeful. I'm an optimistic person that this project and this work that we're doing is going to bear fruit. So anyway, thank you for listening to me droning on, and thank you for being here. This is great. Much appreciated.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. I am not in the legislature, but I might suggest some things for the legislature to consider this year. The first thing I want to say is that money matters. We know that from the research. We know that if you've been in schools. Money matters. It buys good teachers. It buys good teaching. It buys quality buildings. It buys right instructional resources. So money matters. But in Vermont right now, we have a spending problem. We're talking a lot about property taxes, but we have to remember that money is the means, not the ends, and that we have a spending problem. We spend high. And why are we spending high? We're spending high is because we have issues with size and scale. We have very many small school districts. We have 50 school districts in the state with less than 100 children. And the difference in cost for a district with less than 100 children is only $4,500 per pupil versus a district with 300 children. So it also has something to do with opportunity. We care about equity in this state deeply. And to equalize opportunities, we have to equalize educational opportunities in terms of resources. So we have a spending problem also in that we have places that spend a lot more than others and that have more resources than others. So it's not just that we spend high, we also have spending differences that matter. And we need to attend to that as well. We also have a situation where we have offloaded expenses to the ed fund that should be paid with other income and other types of taxes. And when we do that, right, that cost, that burden is borne by property taxpayers. That's a regressive tax instead of income taxpayers and other taxation, where that can be more progressive. And we feel that. Property tax payers feel that right now. And so while we have to think about spending, we also have to think about the progressivity in our taxes that fund the ed fund, and we have to think carefully about what goes in the ed fund. We also have, over time, disinvested in things that improve outcomes. We used to have statewide professional development for teachers. We have guidance now, but we don't make the same kind of investments in math and literacy. Last year, we had an excellent literacy bill come through. We need to implement that as well. So we've got some stuff, right? And it's going to cost some money, and it's going to be hard to disentangle because these things are structural changes, right? We don't have any easy cards to play right now. We have to make serious structural changes. These are systemic changes. And here's the thing, we're all in it together. I think this is really important for this district to remember. Harvard can't do this by itself. And I think your school board feels that all the time, right? You have control of only a certain number of levers. 75% of your budget is personnel, right? And so when 75% of your budget is personnel, you have a limited toolkit when you're faced with trying to cut spending. But we have to remember, just like what you saw on the slideshow that she presented, right? We have a statewide property tax. So what you spend matters, but what other districts spend matter too. And so this isn't a problem that we can just solve by school district by school district. This is going to need state leadership to take on. So we need to think hard about spending. We need to think about drivers of spending, which really are scale. At this point is really scale and size. And we got to think about what we're paying for out of the upfront. Just some things to think about in your spare time.
I was hired by the Harwood board 2.5 years ago, and one of the questions I probed was around budget. And I was told that, don't worry, this district always passes its budget on the first try. Well, that wasn't true last year. But I echo a lot of the same remarks. I see this, I speak as a superintendent, as an educator looking at this school district. I agree with the comments that have been made about scale. There was a good report that was updated, the PICUS report recently, that talks about scale. And we see that we have declining enrollment. with increasing costs and scale that is below what the average is across the country. And I try to remember as well when all of us, I'm a district taxpayer as well, the tax bill, that we have a system that has been built decades, decades, and decades, and we can't dismantle that system. When I was in this auditorium earlier today, there were students in here. Our students rely on us to provide a quality education. We know as school officials that we need to do our job to make sure that we are providing the best education we can, keeping in mind those cost savings, but also we need to work with our school boards to find ways locally and across the state to look at that scale and find ways to improve the scale, because we all agree that this is a problem. I have the privilege of sitting on the commission that Senator Perchlik discussed. I'm the representative of the superintendents across Vermont, so I'm a representative of the Vermont Superintendents Association. So I have, beyond what I've learned along with Lisa and I started the same year, beyond what I've learned with her about our system, I've been immersed in information. In fact, I do also want to introduce Jill Briggs Campbell, who is the Vermont Deputy Secretary of Education. They also produced on just Friday an excellent report that discusses Vermont funding, and I would encourage you to look at that as well. But we just had a meeting this afternoon for about an hour talking about the different pieces of data to analyze ways we can, number one, look at short-term cost containment. But as Lisa pointed out in her one slide, there's not one simple answer. And it's not a short-term answer. It is going to take a lot of people, hard work, to come up with a system that is not just equitable from the sharing of the burden, but is also equitable for our taxpayers and also equitable from the perspective of our students. Because at the same time, what concerns me the most, if you ask me, Mike, what concerns you the most about where we are right now? What concerns me the most is in the short term, we need to cut programs. We need to make cuts to our budget, and that impacts our students. And what we don't want to have, we already have a challenge with an aging population. We don't want our children to flee faster because their educational system is not robust and adequate for their needs. We need to attract younger families, not just people in their mid-50s like me who moved here with my wife a couple of years ago. We need to attract young families. And if we don't have a robust public education system, then we are in trouble as a state.
Thanks everybody for that grim assessment. You know, on the school board, we're kind of wrestling with trying to contain costs, and it's hard to sort out what are big cost savers and what are not so big cost savers. So one thing in a recent survey that was very popular was the idea of consolidation of schools. And I'd like to ask the panel what they think about school consolidation in general. Is it a good long-term solution? Does it have high short-term costs? Just your thoughts on that, please.
Well, I would say I don't have any hard and fast numbers with me at this moment, but again, bringing the conversation back to scale and capacity, it's really important that, to me, we have schools that we have teachers and staff who have an equitable workload in terms of the amount of students that they see and work with each day. And so that we have some sort of standard across the state that we're all following. I think that's really critically important. And I also think, you know, part of this story is about educational opportunities. And from what I have seen and what I have learned, oftentimes when you can think about regionalizing, you can think about offering more opportunities to students. And that's very, very important. I've heard that over and over and over again. So we need to be thinking about it from both angles. You Yeah, I know consolidation is a tricky word. I would like to think of it as more of, re-envisioning the future and thinking in terms of regions and larger areas. But it definitely seems at this point that this is absolutely something that needs to be on the table. We obviously, the voters have spoken. We can't continue to work and function the way we are right now. It's just simply not sustainable, and it's going to require some creative and innovative thinking, which I am prepared to do, and I'm excited to do, and I hope my colleagues are as well. So that's very general, but those are my thoughts.
I think that consolidation is a great idea, and a lot of people support it until you say it's about closing schools. And as somebody that represents a lot of different towns, when I first got in, it was after the big effort to consolidate schools and do so to save money. You go to a school auditorium like this, and you have families crying and saying, "Don't tear the heart out of our community. Don't do this to our kids. It's not fair." Those are very difficult conversations to have. So I think we need to be honest about that. I think there are savings, and I think the one graph that showed the number of faculty or education employees that we have in a school related to the number of students, we can't keep that going like that yawning gap. But closing schools is going to be difficult. And I don't know the best way to have those conversations with those communities who might have their school closed, because I've been in those meetings and it's very painful. And it's difficult when we have a legislature where some of them are legislators are from those districts. So they're going to fight like hell to not close the schools. And they probably won't care what that means for the state, because they want to support their district, and that district may not want to close those schools. So we have to find a way to do that. With the prior act, we tried to give some tax incentives if you consolidated. We tried to give some carrots with the sticks, but that didn't really work. Those carrots were not sufficient, and the sticks were, I think, really painful and didn't really work out either. So if we're gonna, I think we do need to talk about consolidation, which, to be honest, means closing schools and laying off staff. We have to find a way to have those conversations in a fair and equitable way together.
So I think this is an area where we do need to look for a statewide solution. From the history of Vermont, there have been, as our two senators have pointed out, there have been challenges in communities because this has been discussed before. But there are economies of scale, and that's a piece that we do need to look at statewide. I think Dr. Colby mentioned that we have 50 schools in Vermont with fewer than 100 students. And when you look at staffing, that is one of the challenges we have. I'm sorry, districts. Yes, yes, yes.
Closing a school is like closing your post office, right? You lose kind of the heart of your community, and I think that's what Senator Perchlik is getting at, and that's really hard. And so we were all doom and gloom before. Let's talk about some of the opportunities with consolidation, right? A little larger high school, right, or regionalization of high schools or services provides more opportunities for students. If you're a high school that has less than 100 students per grade, you can only probably offer 1 or 2 AP classes at scale, right? You can't offer 2 or 3 foreign languages, right? This district is blessed. It offers Latin, right? But that comes at a cost. And so I think another way to sort of flip the narrative here is, can we think about where consolidation makes sense to offer more opportunities to students? And we can do that through the BOCES, which was the legislature passed last year, which is intermediate school districts, regional school districts. They're used in many states, Pennsylvania, where Dr. Leitner comes from, Michigan, where I come from, New York. And that can really help with things like special education services, right? Where we have small numbers of students with high need disabilities, right? We can provide specialized programs. We can provide other kinds of programs for students who are gifted and talented. So in addition to thinking about closing schools, I just want to add into the narrative, like, I think when we start to talk about consolidation, we can also talk about consolidation up, right? In terms of it being a good thing, in terms of opportunities. But it's hard to have, right? Just like everyone said, right? We're talking about structural changes. And that's going to be really tough. But I do think we need to keep in mind that yes, this saves money, but can we look for the silver lining and look for where it is we can consolidate in ways to provide new opportunities, where we can tap into construction aid to build new 21st century educational facilities, high schools in geographic areas that are co-located, that can bring students together. Those are the kind of opportunities I hope that can come out of the conversation about consolidation, and that we're not just focused on closing small schools.
Well, I will add to that my last school district where I served, our high school had about 1,800 students, which is larger than this school district. And we had about twice as many AP classes for students. So there are more opportunities that are available when you have that larger scale that you're pulling from.
And one of the things that's happening right now is we're using early college as a compensator for that, right? So students who can't take AP classes are going to early college. But what happens when you have early college, right? That number comes out of your denominator now in your school building and your taxes. But it also does something else. When I was down in a school district in the south part of the state, the principal was also telling me about how it changed the school climate to have those students leave the building. Right? And those were real equity concerns too. So, I think we have some hard conversations around that, but I would like to sort of reframe this as, can we think about where the opportunities are?
Okay. Now I'd like to ask a hard question. Those were the warm-ups. It seems to me that a lot of the major drivers of the school budget increases are out of local control and maybe out of state control. In particular, increase in health insurance rates going up double digits every year, special ed costs going up a lot, mental health costs going up, end of COVID era funding. Is that an accurate assessment that these are really problems beyond the district and legislature control, and where we really need help from the feds?
It's an easy question because the answer is yes. Because the hard question is, what do you do about it? And I don't have a good answer to that tough question.
I don't think the feds are coming to help. Right? Health insurance went up 16% last year. Inflation, throw in there 6%, salaries are growing 6%. Right? So you've got a growing share of your budget. I'm going to go back to my opening comment. Quality education costs something. Money matters, right? So we need to figure out how to be as efficient and equitable as we can, but also acknowledging that Vermont really values high quality education, and that's going to come at a cost. So there are things outside the district's control, but things within the district's control are, how do you think about staffing? How do you think about staffing ratios? How do you think about configurations of programs? But the district can't do that alone either, right? And statewide, we have to think about economies of scale, things along those lines, statewide teacher contracts, things along those lines. So these are structural changes, but are we ever going to drive spending down to $10,000 per pupil? That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Not if we want a high quality education system. And so I think we also have to cuddle up to the idea that quality education is going to continue to cost something, right? And I don't think we get a lot of help from the feds in offsetting those costs in the near term. And so we need to figure out how to be efficient, equitable with what we spend, and we need to be thoughtful about where we invest those resources.
And I do think we can tackle some of those issues. Act 173, which deals with special education and providing services for students at an earlier piece, so we don't have, with the idea of intervening earlier in a child's career to provide supports so that they don't need more costly services, is a good thing. That was just implemented as I was moving to Vermont, and it's something that we have not had a chance to fully implement, but I think there are some opportunities there. But it's also been mentioned by a few people, a bill called BOCES, which is regional educational service agencies that can provide not just educational services for specialized needs, but also technical training and assistance at a higher level. That's an area that I can tell you from my experiences here and elsewhere that we don't have in Vermont and we need. It's not necessarily a cost savings. I think it's more in the area of cost containment, but I do believe that there are services we can provide as a state, as regions, that will help us to reduce those costs. And I think that's one piece. It's what we've discussed before. Lisa had mentioned earlier that there's no one single answer. It's cost containment. It is looking at tax rates. It's also looking at our education fund, but we can control those pieces. Another slide that Lisa did not put in because we somewhat ran out of time is we do talk about where are the high cost states. Vermont's one of them. But if you look on a map where the high cost states is, it's the Northeast. I paid high property tax rates where I lived in Pennsylvania. Lisa was telling me, I won't tell you what she paid in New Jersey, but there are high rates in the Northeast because in general, we value education in this region of the country. I had a son who went to university at the University of Alabama, which does not have a good system. So geographically, when you look at the map where there are lower property tax rates and lower educational quality issues, you can see some commonality. So I agree that I think we need to do a better job. There are ways that we can reduce costs. We must do that. But at the same time, we still have to provide high quality students because that's part of our culture and that's part of our history and part of what this community's expectations are for our children.
Really have anything to add. You all said it very, very nicely. I guess I would just say that I do believe public education is a common good. So I think it is something that we all need to pay for. And as I was really honest with my voters during my campaign, when I said, education in Vermont is expensive and it's not going to get cheap anytime soon. So, I mean, that's the unfortunate reality. We can strive for efficiencies and strive to lower costs, but yeah, I think we also need to be honest about how important it is and its cost. Thanks.
I really wanted to add that I think Vermonters are willing to pay for good education, but they don't want to pay more than they have to. But they seems what I get complaints about a lot is when they think there's too much administration. I hear a lot of comments about that. But on the issue about what we can do about these other costs, I think there is a role for the state to just help the communities with budget controls and benefits. If you're doing good budgeting and do good financial management over the years, that there's some benefit to your district. I think right now there isn't that benefit if you're doing the cost containment, that you're going to have lower taxes. And so we need to have that coming down from the state in the way we're doing our formula, that there's more benefit if you think about it and do a good job, that you get the benefit and that you don't just still get penalized with higher taxes, even if you're doing that. And that's something that we need to figure out at the legislature together with the governor.
Build on that. I just want to remind us all that there are other ways to pay for education other than property taxes. Right? And, that is worth considering. I know that there's been discussion about moving to an income tax. Right? There are other ways to think about this. And so that's part of the reason I started out by saying we need to sort of disentangle this into a spending problem and a revenue problem. And those two things need to line up, right? But we need to think about what do we do on the spending side in terms of cost containment. But we also need to think creatively about how we fund public schools in this state, right? And it need not all be property taxes.
Maybe I'll ask one more question that does kind of build on that. We recently did a questionnaire in our district of issues with the school budget, and there was a sense that, well, maybe there are too many administrators in the district. But as I'm learning, it seems to me we need a lot of administrators because there are a lot of unfunded or underfunded state and federal mandates, particularly for reporting And as is mentioned, maybe some mental health costs and special ed costs don't belong in the budget at all. So I'd be interested to hear. Kind of a leading question because I know Mike has strong feelings about this, about whether there really is an excess of administrators around.
As the only administrator sitting at the table, I'll go ahead and answer that one. But I will say I think we do have a lot of administrators in the state. I think we have, if you look again, but refer back to this to the chart Lisa showed with the staff. We have a lower ratio of staff to students. That translates to teachers, support staff, administrators. We have more small schools, and Dr. Colby is also on the State Board of Education. And what I had mentioned to Dr. Rosenberg is that there is Rule Series 2200, Educational Quality Standards, which says that for every 10 full-time teachers in the school, there shall be, and again, words in law are critical, there shall be one full-time principal. So there are also things that occur. Probably the most recent example I can give is I was in my car. I got a phone call from the principal of the Waitsfield School saying the Vermont State Police just called with a report of a potential active shooter. It turned out to be a swatting incident. But if that were a case, if I were a parent and a principal was not in that school, the principal could immediately was able to check the restroom, was immediately able to secure the building. We live in a different society. I had a predecessor as superintendent who was a superintendent in the 1970s who shared with me stories about having one principal share 3 buildings. And number one, that's not legally permissible with at least Harwood, with our size of schools, because all of our schools have at least, our small school, the Payson School has 15 full-time teachers. But there are regulatory issues. I had conversations with 3 of our principals today who spent most of their day dealing with one particular incident involved around the state's law called hazing, harassment, and bullying. There are time-consuming pieces that our administrators deal with and that our parents and teachers expect that they will handle. So I think scale does tackle that. But I think it's a good question for our taxpayers to ask. And it's a reminder that we have issues that we need to look at scale in the state.
I like to call them instructional leaders. And what does the research tell us about good instructional leaders? That they have better schools, that they provide vision, they provide leadership, right? And thank you for your service, because that's exactly what you do every day. I had the privilege of chairing the staff to student ratios committee a few years ago. And I looked up Harwood's numbers. And for 2017, 2018, Harwood actually had one of the highest ratios in the state, of about 126-6, which was larger than Essex Westford, which was 84-1, and Colchester had 67-1. So I would suggest in this district, there isn't quite the same. I mean, you're actually on the other end of the spectrum, right, in terms of administration. But I do think we have to be careful because that's sometimes feels like an easy target because they're not necessarily in the classroom with students every day. But I think Dr. Leichner just gave some really good examples. And again, I like to think about instructional leadership, not administrators, because I think that's what you do every day. So thank you.
Thank you. The ability to boast a little bit, because if you read the Burlington Free Press recently, you will see U.S. News and World Report's Best Elementary Schools, Best Middle Schools edition. And I just mentioned our Waitsfield School, who was our longest serving principal, who's been in our district in that building for in the neighborhood of 15 years. And in the U.S. News and World Report's Best Elementary Schools in Vermont, Waitsfield came out, it's either second or third. I'm looking at Ashley, third. So third, according to U.S. News, top school. We have a really strong leader in a lot of our buildings. That building is one of them. And there is research that very clearly shows that there is a correlation between strong educational leaders and high performance schools.
I was going to add in terms of administration, one thing we don't think about a lot, but it's a reality. We're a pretty litigious society. When something doesn't go right, or something happens that is problematic, we tend to go to the courts and we sue. And I know that I've talked to a lot of our administrators who spend a lot of time dealing with paperwork for unfunded federal and state mandates, as well as just making sure that, you know, legally we are dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. And when there is an issue, having to navigate that system is time consuming and costly. And unfortunately, a lot of our administrators would love to have more student time, more student contact, but they do spend a lot of their time doing paperwork, Title I, Title IX, all of these various laws that we have across our land that are a burden. And that's unfortunate, but that is, again, you know, this is the system that we're in. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much to all the panel. We do have some time if people in the audience would like to ask questions or make comments. We have a couple people with microphones, so just raise your hand.
And that is Cashel, one of our star students, who will help you out.
In terms of the microphone, I'm going to say, I think we have a state-of-the-art microphone system here. And nobody has to scream, but you have to talk into your microphones. So we have a problem here. We can hear it. Said, sometimes people speak into the microphone, we hear everything. Sometimes you move your head, and we don't hear you. So we want to hear you. But anyway, that's not exactly what I wanted to say. I think that's important. But beside that, did I see that the average cost per student is $13,400? About on that.
That was hard.
Did I see that?
Yes, that was the state average.
And the average cost for a special needs student is $67,000 each.
No, that's for extra costs. So for a special ed student that exceeds $67,638, it's what's called the extraordinary threshold. Once we exceed that cost per student, we then get 95%, anything above that cost, back into the district.
What is the average cost per special needs student?
I don't have it in front of me, but I could get that for you.
Nationally, it is 0.9.
29,000?
No, 0.9, right? So if you have $10,000 per student, the additional, on average, it's 0.9 more. So the total spending for a student receiving special education would be 19,000, whereas the spending for a general education student would be 10,000. So the national multiplier is 0.9 more.
Another thing I don't understand, I hear that the average cost per student in Vermont is close to $30,000. And this video said it was $13,400. I heard that the average cost per student in Vermont, is that a crazy figure? That's why the cost in Vermont, $13,400 for each student? That's pretty reasonable, I think.
Yeah, that's the average. That's across the state, the average cost per student. If you take all the educational spending across the district, that's
that's equalized pupil,
that's
Lisa.
equalized pupil, correct? That's using the weighted equalized count of the students.
So
The straight math is for 2023, the average per pupil expenditure in the state was $30,158. That was the average. For supervisory unions less than 1,000, it was $39,360. For supervisory unions with greater than 2,000, it was $25,927.
and our average cost is only $13,500.
But that we're comparing what's called our weighted equalized students. So each category of students are
What
weighted.
is the cost per student? Average cost per student in Vermont? without all the accounting stuff.
I believe
What
it's,
is
I believe it is
stupid
22,322. Does that sound right, Mike? I think it's 22,322, Jill, is that correct?
I have another question. The senator said that they had a problem because at the end of the term, they saw that the figures were ridiculous and it was very hard to do to make a study in 1 year. What's been going on for the last 25 years? Why is a study 1 year? Why did it just stop? That seems crazy to me. Shouldn't there be an educational cost study every year?
Well, there is in a way that it goes in front of the voters of every town every year, and they have to decide to support it or not. But there's been numerous studies on and on and on. What I'm talking about was last year when we were looking at these very high property tax increases because of that, very high costs. So there's, been other years where when it's around inflation, it's not such a concern. You don't get such an uproar. But last year was, from the beginning of the session, we worked on it for the whole session, and shame on us for not coming up with a better solution at the end. But that's what I was referring to is how do you get the property tax down in 1 year from 40% down to the 14%.
Okay, now we cannot have consolidation of schools. It's very hard. I think our school district is pretty well consolidated, especially at the high school level. But can we have any consolidation of teachers in certain courses? Can one teacher teach the same course in different schools to five high schools at once? Certain courses,
Okay.
not.
I'm going to ask that we answer this question, then move on to someone else.
It could be done using high technology. And since there's 10 months in the school year, if you taught at 5 schools, you would be 2 months in each school. And then you would, in those 2 months, you would broadcast the other 4 schools. But for 2 months, you would be on the campus. We have to save money. The only place to save money is where you're spending 75% of your cost. It's not in all these other areas. You'll never cut the money. It has to be where the big money is being spent. So we have to figure out a way to increase the quality of education and for less cost. Now I find that there's sometimes outstanding teachers in certain courses that could learn how to do it using video. Every other industry is cutting costs using technology. I haven't heard any talk about the use of technology to cut costs. We must find a way to cut costs by quite a bit.
Thank you.
This is outrageous.
Thank you.
20%. My taxes went up 20%. I'm 86 years old. I can't
Right.
make any more money.
I love it. I love it when guests ask questions and propose ideas and solutions. So thank you. That was brilliant. I appreciate that. A couple things. We operate sort of at this hyper local level, right? But we're trying to think systemically across the state. So we're in that transition period. But I agree. I'm a new senator, so I say to my voters, don't blame me because I just got here. But yeah, it seems like we should have been able to see these demographic trends coming a while back. And we need to keep our eye on that. A couple of things I wanted to mention. We did pass this BOCES bill last year, which is going to allow us to think more regionally. And it is going to allow us to share staff, like a special educator or a speech and language pathologist. We're going to be able to share transportation costs. So this is one step toward a more regional approach. And I agree, we need to be able to share teachers, administrators, possibly, and other things, and other humans. So that is, I appreciated that question. I wanted to mention that there is also an online Vermont collaborative. Jill, what's it called? Vermont Virtual Learning Collaborative, which is a wonderful thing that we have here in Vermont, where students can take online courses with other students from all over the state. And we have certified teachers teaching those classes, and it's a great way to take a course that might not be offered in your school. So I just wanted to mention we are using technology, and it is really helpful, and I would say probably cost effective and efficient too. So thanks again for your questions.
Hello, my name is Christopher, and I'm curious as we think about this next legislative session for the two senators. If you're looking at spreading out the burden of cost increases on homestead, non-homestead, and other sources, so it doesn't all fall in one category, and particularly really pushing up property taxes, and it seems like that's something that could be done this year in addition to the cost containment. So how are you thinking about that and spreading across the various sources, any cost increases?
I would just say yes. The answer is yes. Everything is on the table, everything and anything. And, you know, a lot of folks are talking about putting some of the burden on a more income tax base, which is a more progressive tax than property tax. But I'm going to punt right now to my colleague, Dr. Colby, because I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on our education finance system and some possibilities for the future.
You set me up. 33 states in the country operate a foundation formula that operates very differently from how we fund education in Vermont. There's no constitutional reason we can't do that here. And foundation formula would basically set an adequate number, an adequate spending amount for every district in the state that then the state would equitably help fund. That's one way to start to think about how we moderate spending and we create a more direct link between what we think we should be spending and what some districts think they should be spending. I think the second thing we got to think about is to create a more direct link between spending and local revenues. Harwood does a really good job and always has of being careful and thinking very well about sort of how it spends its money and uses scarce resources. We have other districts in the state that may not take the same care. We have districts right over the hump here that unconsolidated themselves last year and are now spending a lot more per pupil because they decided not to consolidate anymore. There are a lot of things going on, and so it's impossible for Harwood to solve the problem by itself. But we've got to create a direct link between local spending and local property taxes. We need to establish a statewide adequate spending amount with adjustments for student differences in student need and essential differences in scale and scope. And we need to be clear what that number is. I would advocate setting that number as yield equals 1. We need to put in place revenue recapture in districts that decide that they want to spend even higher than the adequate amount. We need to incentivize further district school construction and consolidation, again, with opportunities and additional construction aid. We've had a moratorium on construction aid in the state for a long time. We need to pay for school-based mental health services and human services using general fund revenues. There's been a cost shift over time in this state where we've had a situation where we used to pay, particularly through our designated agencies, for mental health services, health and human services. As the resources for those services have declined out of the general fund, schools picked it up, as they should. They care about kids, those kids need services. When that shift happened, those costs got shifted to school budgets and to property taxpayers. They used to be paid for by a progressive income tax. We also need to think carefully about the ed fund. One of the things that happens when we have dedicated funding systems like we have now, it makes it very easy to offload things to the ed fund. You saw the list. And the ed fund is primarily funded by property taxes and other taxes. It may be time for us to think about what the ed fund is and is not, in how we fund the ed fund and the extent to which we rely on property taxes from the ed fund. Those are just a few ideas.
It's great. We're lucky to have Dr. Colby with us in working on these issues in Vermont. She's been helpful over the years on giving us good data. But we just have to be honest about the switch to an income tax. If we don't dealing with the spending problem that Dr. Colby mentioned that we had at the beginning, it does mean that your income taxes are going to go up. And so as long as people are honest about that, then I think it's a good thing to do. And I think by just moving some of those things that the local school boards don't have control over to the general fund, that's basically moving it to the income tax or the other taxes that we raise. But it could mean that we're going to have to raise those taxes. And I think Vermonters are willing to pay for a good education. And if they feel it's a fair tax, it's very difficult to do on property tax. You get that one bill you pay once or twice a year, or if you're sometimes more often, but that's a very difficult way to come up with those big numbers. But we can't just pretend that by moving the money to other taxes, we're not going to be spending it. So we need to do both. I think we can, and to answer the question about this session, I think there are things we can do this session to move some of those monies off of the education fund, but we still have to pay them. And so that could mean taxes to go up to we're able to do it. So we need to be looking at the spending equally as we are the shifting of the tax.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and listen. A question, so to me it sounds like a little bit an egg and a chicken problem we have here, where you have the school board putting together the finance committee and doing work on how to solve the problem here and now while the state is doing it as well. And I can see how it might cripple at the local level, not knowing what might come down the pipe in the future, because if let's say we move towards consolidation and then the state decides to do something different and then you didn't have to do the consolidation, you feel like you made maybe the wrong choice for the community. So I know that it's difficult, but I'm curious if there's a process over the next year, because this is no longer an emergency now. Now we know about it. Is there a process to facilitate a conversation between the state and all the various finance committees to talk about what's going on, so that the finance committees can make these decisions not in vacuum, but in some kind of bigger, broader context?
You're on the commission.
So it's my turn to go first. And this is one of the pieces. So the commission I serve on, we have been working since July. As with any commission, when you start up the work, one of our goals is to look at all of the different studies in different areas and to make some recommendations. We have a preliminary report that's due in December. In addition to being on the overall commission, I serve on the Education Finance Subcommittee. We had a meeting Monday, yesterday. I'm losing track of the week. It feels like it should be Thursday already. Monday, and then we have another one this coming Monday. So we will have some preliminary recommendations. But again, the answers are, we need to be looking everywhere. One of the challenges that we have is the work that occurs at the school district level to build a budget in the legislature happens somewhat off season. So we're already working on our budget. Lisa really has to present it. Our board has to act in January so that it has time to be warned for town meeting beginning in March. January is when the legislative session starts up. So this year, I think there is going to be a little bit of a mismatch. It's going to be very challenging. We are dealing with a very tough budget year to stay at a percentage that we think is reasonable to fund education, but also hopefully reasonable to be able to ask our taxpayers to support. So that work is already at play. So I think this year you're going to see a lot of attention to it. I know from the legislators I've spoken to that this is a top priority. It's also a top priority at the local level. So I think we all this year need to do our piece for cost containment to keep those costs as low as possible, knowing that real solutions are going to take a couple of years. This is not quick and easy, but I do think that a lot of the work has to start, even if it's a long-term type of solution, whether it's looking at school construction and ways to optimize size. That work has to start with our legislature this session, so that work can be in place moving forward. And I think we are going to see a lot of activity. We're hearing that I know from just, again, our meetings that the Governor Scott's administration is going to come out with proposals. So I think we are looking for everyone to come together to find ways to solve the issues we have and make sure that we're taking care of our kids.
Just wanted to add, I think it's a real smart observation, and it's a problem that we have that I heard when I was on the education committee, that local school boards and local communities feel like they get a little whipsawed by the legislature, that they think they're figuring out one thing and then we change it on them. And if we want to have local control, like give us local control, then leave us alone. I think when you have a foundation formula, you can get closer to that, where you can give more autonomy over the budgeting of the school to the school board, and they don't have to go through all this complicated math to tell their taxpayers what the effect is going to be. And they don't have to worry so much about the legislature changing it to where everything you did turns out to be wrong or totally different than you thought because the legislature keeps changing everything. So I think the foundation formula has that benefit. There's some negatives to it as well, but I think that could be one of the benefits, that the local school board and the local community can decide to spend more. They're just going to have to raise it amongst themselves. And then it's just a much simpler conversation to have than to try to figure out the formula.
The only thing I would add is that was a great question. Thank you for asking it. And also, toward the end, you asked about consolidation and will we get to a place where we were, we look back and we think, well, that wasn't the right decision. And from where I'm sitting, I just hope that we are always embracing consolidation and that it becomes a positive and it becomes something that we can all be hopeful about and not regret. So again, just optimism here, but I do hope that that's our mindset in the future. Thanks.
Hard for me to see. Maybe time for one more question?
I have one question and then a comment. What other states in the U.S. have a Brigham decision type of mandate for equity for students?
All state constitutions, including Vermont, have an equal protection clause that includes education. I'm trying to think. I don't know of a state that has not had a court case that looks like Brigham, where there has been a lawsuit over inequitable educational opportunities and funding. Vermont is unusual in that we have not litigated since 1997. Most states have had multiple court cases at this point.
So we were behind
We were ahead at one point. And then we were ahead in 1997, but the school finance field and the court, the litigation and the court cases have evolved since then quite a bit. And in the 90s, the focus was on equitable distribution of inputs, right? How do we equalize money? The courts have shifted significantly since that time, and the court cases now are really focused in most other states on equitable outcomes, right? And differential funding and ensuring that funding is adequate to meet all students' needs. And so that's been a fundamental shift in sort of the way the courts have thought about this over time. But I don't know of a state where we haven't had litigation. Most states have had multiple rounds of litigation where the courts have further clarified what, the interpretation of that equal protection clause. Vermont is unusual in that we have not done that since Brigham.
Thanks. So the only school-related vote that I cast a no vote for in my entire life is initially around the consolidation and creating districts. It wasn't an easy vote for me to make. My dad was in public education his entire life, believed in it deeply. was administrator at this school at one point. I'm pretty sure that probably not in my lifetime, but I suspect that essentially Vermont will adopt a single superintendency at some point to adequately meet the demands of equity. It doesn't seem to me that being able to adequately fund education in Vermont and make it a relatively straightforward and not necessarily simple process, but being able to, coming to public forums like this and having to wade through the complexities of this funding is ludicrous. It does not pass the straight face test. It just does not. And it needs to change. I don't want to see consolidation happen. I would, preferably, I think I would get rid of the consolidated districts if it meant one superintendent could oversee everything, because these small schools mean a lot to the communities. The legislature and the school districts are talking to one another. They're continuing to do good work, but it really needs to get to a point where people can understand the process relatively straight, in a straight face test. The election this year should have been, and it probably was, an incredible wake-up call. It should not have been unanticipated. And we do not know what to expect from DC, what's going to happen from the federal perspective. So I think that's another challenge that hasn't been brought up at this point. So I would encourage everyone involved with this process to make sure that you can sit down with my 12-year-old granddaughter and explain how education funding works in Vermont. Because I would suspect that if you tested the people in this room right now about how this process works, that it would be a pretty dismal outcome. And I'll leave it at that. And I appreciate everyone's passion about this, but I also believe that it has gone beyond the pale at this point in terms of how we do this in Vermont.
I was going to say that if you give that test to legislators, we wouldn't pass it either. It is way too complex. But what complexity comes to equity and some of the fairness. So you can make it very simple and just say your school will raise all the money for your costs, but that would mean some towns will have enormously high property taxes. So the complexity helps with the fairness in the sharing of the burden, and so that we can have well-educated students throughout the whole state. So there is a balance there, but in general, I agree with you.
I agree also. I have a problem with the pause. It needs to be something that we can all understand. I agree. But I also don't think we should conflate complexity with the fact that that is the cost. That's not a cost driver. It's just complex. So I don't think we should conflate the two, but I agree that it needs to be a lot more simple.
That's it. Okay, I see one more question, then we'll call it a night.
Hi, my name is Travis, and I graduated from this school. I got an awesome education. Love this school. But you know what? I've lived here my whole life. I gotta work 14 hours a day just to survive here in Vermont. I don't live here, I survive here. My taxes doubled this year. And I didn't know that until a month before the bill was due in our town of Norton. We got an infrastructure problem in our town. We need a septic system. We need fire hydrants. We only have one. My ISO rating for my insurance doubled my insurance this year because we got the worst ISO rating. Or PPG rating. What I'm trying to say is, I'm sick of working 14 hours a day. My hands are bleeding right now. I got gouges in my hands. I just came off a 14-hour day to come to this meeting. And I'm sick of all this ridiculous spending. and cost of everything doubling every year. We can't handle it anymore. You know, I'm young, was young at one time, I'm 46 now. I don't know if I'm gonna see anything older than that here. It's too expensive. Straighten out, figure it out, and come up with a better system, because the taxpayers are sick of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being honest and sharing your frustration, your anger, and your pain. We need to hear it. And I really appreciate you having the courage to do that in this space. Thank you very much. I think we're committed to doing what we can. One of the things I had to tell folks this summer on occasion, because I get emails in July saying, do this thing, Senator Gulick, do this thing. I have to remind them, I am a part-time legislator. I work in Montpelier from January to May. And I'm not in session right now. I would like to help you, and I will help you as best I can, but we have a part-time legislature, and it's tricky. So yes, get mad at us, yell at us, tell us what you're thinking, but we also have to look to our state leadership. And I'm not pointing fingers. I don't want to get into an argument or fight about this, but we have to work with the governor. We have to work with the agencies. They're there full-time. They have salaries. They're experts in their fields. And that's the reality. It's not one person or one body's fault. We all have to do this work together. But I can tell you, and when I'm at home in July, I can't, there's not a lot I can do. And again, I don't want to pass the blame, but that's just the reality. Some people think we work year round. We don't. So thank you again. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks to everybody for questions and comments. I want to make just one final announcement that the school board and its finance committee will be holding 2 public meetings, just like this one, to gather public comment, feedback. The first one will be December 5th at the Crossett Brook Cafeteria at 6 p.m. And the second one on December 10th will be a Zoom meeting at 6 p.m. So again, I hope you can all join us. So I would like to thank our panel very much. They had some tough questions, gave some good answers, and they did not solve all our problems, but they tried. So thanks very much.